Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. Today, we're going to build out our own analog clock with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We're actually going to write our own SVG from scratch as well, and I'd like to do this in two different stages. To start with, we're going to build out a single clock, and we're going to use more of a functional programming style, so just writing a function that's going to update our single clock. Then about halfway through, what I'd like to do is transition over to a more object-oriented approach and move our function over to a class in JavaScript. And then we're going to actually install an npm package and get Parcel to run up a dev server. And that's going to allow us to actually quickly create these different instances of different time zones all over the world. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. Before I do too much though, you can check out the final code here on my website, or you can go to the GitHub here and look under the main branch. This will be the finished code. If you're only interested in kind of the JS and CSS without the object-oriented approach and all that kind of stuff, then that code will be here. And then if you have improvements you'd like to make, I always have a community improvements branch when I remember to do it. And I'd love for you to do a pull request or just make some improvement on this. I know there's ways that this can be improved, but without any more talking, let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so over here on the left, I've got just an index.html page opened in this directory called world clock. And on the right, I've got some tabs open. Let's go ahead and start then with some boilerplate here. We'll call this world clock. I actually won't have too much here. We're going to write our SVG here, so that'll be most of the main work here. But let's go ahead and add a main tag. And then inside here, we'll have a tag or a div with a class of container. And then inside here, we're going to have another div that'll have the class of clock wrapper. And then let's go ahead and just do like an h2, say like my time. Finally, I'll have a div with a class of clock, just like that. So what we're going to do is inside here, actually write our SVG. Now, I don't know why I've got this open. I don't need this open anymore. And let's go ahead and open this in live server. Okay, so we've got my time, and that's about it. Okay, so I'm going to come in here, and the first thing I'm going to do is create an SVG tag. Now, I've done a little bit with SVGs in the past, and I'll try to remember to link those videos if you're interested in learning more. To start with, though, I'm going to go ahead and give this SVG a class here. We'll just call it clock face, and that way we can reference it in our CSS. Next, I'm going to set a width on here of 300, and this needs to be in quotation marks. And then we're going to do a height that's the same, so 300. And then, importantly, we need a view box. Now, this essentially is going to tell HTML kind of how to draw this. And so the first few numbers we're going to give it are going to be the X and the Y coordinates. So starting at the top left, 0, 0 is what that says. Then I want it to go over 300 and I want it to go down 300. So if I were to come in here and actually let's go ahead and open up a style sheet. Let's link this up first. So link.css, style.css, and then let's pull this up over here. And I'm going to go ahead and just say SVG background color. We'll do, yeah, aqua. It doesn't matter. We're just to kind of show you where stuff's at. Okay, so what we've done is we've said, hey, start the SVG here, go down 300 and go over 300. So that's why we've got a box. And because we've set our width and our height to the exact same thing, it should allow scaling to kind of work as you would expect it. Now, what we're going to need to do is draw inside of here a few different objects that we can use in SVGs. Let's close the sidebar here. The first thing will be the outer circle, and that's going to kind of draw all those little dots around the outside. So we can do that with a circle tag, and this is a self-closing tag. And here we need to give it a few kind of things so it knows where to start and end and all that kind of stuff. So first of all, we need the circle X, and that's telling it kind of where it should be positioned inside this SVG. So by default, it's 0, but if I said like 15, you're going to see how that works in a second. And I'll say CY, that's the circle Y up and down, and let's say like 30 here. Now I also need to give it a radius, so that's a R like that. And the radius, of course, is just kind of half the circle width. So I'm going to set it at 145. So since this height is 300, it's just under half, which means the circle will basically fill up that entire SVG, or just about. Let's go ahead and save it, and you actually see by default it gets a fill color that's black. Now because I have my starting position at 15 over and 30 down, if I were to change these here to 0 and 0, you're going to actually see it move up and over. And you see how it actually moves, and now this is the exact middle of the circle, which is also the starting point of this view box. So there's a couple different ways we can fix this, but to get the most natural kind of response that you would expect, what I actually want to do is move the 0, 0 position so that everything that rotates is going to rotate around this spot. I want to move it to right here. And maybe counterintuitively, negative numbers on both are going to actually move it right down here. So negative makes sense on the y direction. For whatever reason, I would expect negative to move it this way on the x direction, but it doesn't. So you have to go negative 150 and negative 150. When I do that, it actually moves that center point right here. Now everything we're going to rotate, including our hands and all that kind of stuff, it's going to always rotate around the very center of wherever we started the view box by default. Now you can also change kind of where things rotate around, but if you keep everything right in the center, then it's easy enough and you don't have to worry about that on each of the individual elements. Now I mentioned that by default this has a fill, and so we actually want to change this to transparent. When I do this, it should disappear. So now what I need to do is add a stroke, and here, this color, I'm going to do like red for now. All right. So stroke is essentially the same as like a border, and then the fill would be like the background color. And that's how you would define it on an SVG circle like this. Now you can also set something called stroke, width, I think. And you can set this to like 5, something like that. Now the nice thing is, you might think, well, these are pixels, so isn't that kind of locked in? But it's not. SVGs actually draw themselves dynamically, and so if you zoom up, everything is in relation to this view box and this width and height. So by setting it like this isn't 5 pixels necessarily. It depends on the person's browser and their zooming desires, their zooming preferences. Okay, so we've got that set. We've set the color of the stroke to red. Now what I want to do is create little dashes. If we go back to kind of the live example over here, you're going to see we've got these dashes, and we've got these pink ones, and we've got these white ones. There's a bunch of different ways you could do this, but the easiest way is actually just to tell it basically how long the length of that line should be, that path should be. So we can set a property called path length here, and if I set it here to 60, that's how many dots I want around, I'm basically saying, hey, I want to be able to break this up however I want into 60 chunks. Now this doesn't automatically break it up, but it does allow us to use something called stroke dash array. And then you can give this a number. So like if I give it 10, you're going to see that I actually get this broken up in 10 segments. And because I define the path length, I'm basically saying take 10, and then 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 10. So I'm actually basically defining how long each of these strokes are with a combination of the dash array and this path length. So what I can do though is I can pass it multiple values, and it basically just alternates between those. But because I know that basically each single one should give me 60, what I can do is just make sure that the two numbers I give it add up to 1. So if I say like 0.1, here you're going to see they're really small, but if I say 0.1 and 0.9, then I'm going to say, hey, the first one, give me just a single line, second one, give me 0.9, and together they reach 1, which is a 60th of my path length. So that's going to give me 60 of those little dots all the way around. Now, one thing that's a little hard to see is that it's actually slightly tilted. And if I change this to say like, let's actually change this, let's say like 2 and 4 or something like that, you're going to see that it's not quite in the middle. So I'd want this line and this line to be exactly on the horizon. So the way we're going to do that is with another property called stroke dash offset. And this is going to be equal to basically half of my little dotted line here. So 1 in this case is going to make it exactly where I want it to be. So it's going to alter it just slightly. That's not -1. Again, that's one of those things that I would expect it to be -1 to go up, but it's actually +1 spins it that way. So now what I need to do is we're going to set this to 0.05, and I'm going to set this to 0.1 and then the space to 0.9. And that will give me exactly in the middle. And I don't know if you can see this, but let me actually take this off. You see it just rotates slightly there. These are horrendous colors. I'm not sure what I'm thinking here, but we'll change this in a second. Okay, so I've got that set, and this is my first circle. I'm concerned about that outer rim. Now the second one I'm concerned about, we're going to do the same basic thing, except in this case, I'm going to change the amount here. Now I know that with this path length, I'm going to have 12 of those divisions. So I'm just going to change this to 12, and that means very much the same thing. I want this to be equal to 1 here. So I'm going to change this, actually make this a little bit wider. Let's do like 10 or something like that. And you can see now that I've got kind of larger bandings there. Now it is actually important the order of these. So if I come in here and change this to blue, you're going to see that that's on top, which is what I want. But if I were to put this before the other one, like this, you're going to see that the seconds actually go over the top of that. So the order of this is basically the order that they're going to display in the DOM as far as like z-index is concerned. All right, before we go insane, let's go ahead and actually change some of this styling. So the first thing I'm going to do is do both a clear and then some colors here. And I'm grabbing these colors from this Happy Hues site. I've used this before in the past, but it just gives you some colors, and that's basically what I'm using in this clock. Okay, so I'm going to come back this way and save this, and some of that weird styling should go away. Now, let's go ahead and style some stuff. So we've got the body, and here we'll set our background color to var of background, and that should give us that dark blue color. And we'll say display grid and place item center, and that will keep everything in the center, that main tag that we've got. Now, to make sure that it displays properly in the middle, we're going to do 100 view height as a minimum height. And then for the font family here, let's just use an Apple System UI, and this will basically fill in with kind of default values. All right, next I'm going to set the font size here to 2 rem. And then let's go ahead and zoom out to normal level just so we can see what it's going to look like. Okay, now inside the body we had the main tag. That's just going to hold the container that holds all of our clock wrappers. So let's go ahead and grab our container here. And we're going to do a display of flex on here and flex wrap of wrap, which will be important later on in the video. And then we'll say justify content center to keep everything in the center of the screen even when it wraps. And then we'll do a gap of 4 rem and then a margin of 1 rem. This gap isn't totally supported in older browsers, so you'd need some kind of auto prefixer probably if you're going to put this in production, but this should work just for this example. Now the clock itself is in something called a clock wrapper. And here we're going to do display of grid and place items center. And this will allow us to position this text and the SVG kind of next to each other. And here again, we're going to do a gap of 2 rem, and then color here will be our var of white. Now, I do actually want to do a little drop shadow on this face of the clock here. So I think we call that clock face, if I remember correctly. And we're going to say filter drop shadow here. And the reason I'm doing a drop shadow instead of a box shadow, well, let me just show you. All right, so if I come in here and say box shadow, and we say like 0 pixels, 0 pixels, 10 pixels, and var of background, sure. Or actually, you're not going to be able to see that. Back dark there. You see it actually draws it around the SVG box, and I don't want that. I actually want it to be around the circle itself. This is another one of those things that I think isn't totally supported everywhere, so you'd need an auto prefixer. But for now, I'm just going to drop it in here, and we're going to change some of these values. So we'll have it go over to the right 2 pixels, down 10 pixels, and then we'll have 10 pixels of blur, and we will leave it on that var of dark. Let me get my semicolon in the right spot. And so it basically should give us this down here. Now, why am I not getting that? Maybe it wasn't called clock face. All right, let's come back here. It was called clock face. All right, I am not seeing it though, so let's zoom in. And let's change this to something obnoxious just to double check. Okay, so we actually are getting it. It's just that right now there's no solid background anywhere, so we're just getting it behind each of these things. All right, so that makes sense. We'll fix that here in just a second. Now what I'd like to do, let's zoom this back out, and then I'm going to move it over just to give us a little bit more space, because I'd actually like to transition some of these styles from our SVG over to the CSS. Now, not all of these can be moved over, but I think it's nice to kind of keep the SVG as limited as possible and do a lot of the styling in the CSS file, because that's where I'd expect to see it, and it cleans up the HTML a little bit. So let's do a few things first. I'm going to go ahead and click here and then hold down my option key and click again. Then we're going to say class here. I'm going to give both of these a class of ring because they're like the outside ring of the clock. And then we'll say ring dash dash. For one of them will be hours and the other one will be minutes. Now this is the hours one, and this one would be the minutes, or I guess seconds, right? Seconds. Now what I can do is come in here, and just in case I need both of those rings, I don't think I actually do, but I usually at least have them have a shared class in case I do. So we're going to say ring seconds first. And here I actually want to fill this back one here with a color of var dark. And when I do that, now you see actually that filtered drop shadow does show up now. Next, I'm going to change the stroke here. We're going to change it to our var of pink. And that gives us a more pleasant color than that red. And then let's go ahead and move over, let's see, up here. We can move, this path length needs to stay. The stroke width could be moved over. We just move the stroke color. We just move the fill. So let's take the stroke width and move that over. I'm going to change this here. We need to set it to 5 like that. And then I can take both of these as well and move them over. So let's do that. I'll come in here, and taking them off, you see now gives me that full normal line all the way around. But I can set this like this, and then remove the parentheses on that, or the quotation marks on that as well. Okay, so that should be all set to go. Now let's do the same thing. We're going to just drop this down, and then I'm going to change this to, what was that, hours? And here I actually want this fill to be transparent, which is what I have on the actual SVG, but we'll remove that here in a second over here. And then I want the color here to be my purple. And if you see over here, I've got that stroke width of 10. So let's change this to 10. And then all the rest of that looks the same. So let's get rid of this here, and here, here, and here. All right, so that cleans that up nicely. And now this is looking much more like how we'd expect it to. Now I think I actually want this a little bit finer. So let's change this to 0.05. And to now get it rotating properly, I need to change this to 0.025. To make this a full 1, then I need to make this 0.95, and this should give me kind of a better look, which I think is what I'm going for. All right, so we've done 2 circles so far. I've actually got one more circle I want to build out. There's a little circle in the middle. Let's copy this down, and then I'll jump back over here. I don't know if you can see that. There's just a little circle that kind of makes it look more natural, like a watch face. And so let's come in here. I'm going to just change, this will be 0, that's 0, because I want it in the middle. Just the radius, I'm going to change to 3. I don't need a path length because it's just going to be a stroke. And right now you can see it over here because it has this ring hours on it still. So let's get rid of this and say a ring center. And then I'll go ahead and save it there. And now it's just a little black filled circle because that's the default. Let's copy this down and change this to ring of center. And here I actually want the var pink as my fill. And the stroke here I want as white. And then I'm going to set the stroke width to 2.5, and then we don't need any dashes, so let's remove that. Now I see a couple problems. Number one, I have a double dash here and a single dash here, so that's not why nothing's showing. So now it should properly show, and I'll zoom in just a touch so you can see that. There's that little pink circle in the middle, and then the ring on the outside of the stroke. The other thing is, like I mentioned, 0 is the default for all of these here. If we have our view box starting at 0, 0, basically in the middle by moving it 150, then I can actually remove these all. Actually, let's grab all of these. Command-Shift-L will grab all those. Let's just remove all of those, and that cleans up this even more. So I've just got 3 circles so far. Now I need to add 5 more elements. We've got the 2 things of text, the AM and PM, and then the date, and then I've also got the 3 hands. So let's start with the hands, and we're going to add that as a line. Again, this is a self-closing tag, and it's a little bit different. Let's go ahead and add our class on here, and we're just going to call this hand, and then hand minute to start with. And just like the circle has a C and then an X to give it the starting point, we want the same thing here, except it'll be X and then 1, which I know doesn't make a lot of sense, but you have an x1, which is the x coordinate that it starts at, and then a y1, which is the y coordinate it starts at, and then y1 or y2 and x2, and kind of go from there. And this allows you to draw a line where you'd like it to go. So in this case, I'm going to start this at 0 on the x position, the x-axis, and then I'm going to start the y1 at 2. Now if I save it here, nothing's going to happen, but it is actually right there in the middle. It's just that it has no length right now. So let's give it an x2 coordinate, and I want it to stay at the same position on the x-axis, but for the y, I actually want it to go negative 110, and that will move it straight up. Now in order for that to be visible, let's go ahead and come over here. We're just going to grab the hand class, which will be all our hands to start with, and let's just set this to stroke. I need a color on here, var of pink. When I do this and save it, it should now show up. And so I'm starting actually just below, so just a little bit past on 2 down here on the y-axis and going up 110. Now we're also going to add a stroke line cap, and here I just want it to be round, and that will kind of give it a rounded feel, which you can't really see on this tiny one, but we'll see on the next one. So that's the minute hand, and I'll eventually need to make that a little bit thicker. Let's go ahead and now do the hour hand. Now that will all be the exact same, except we're just going to not make it go quite as high. So let's change that to 60. Now, in order to kind of see where stuff is at, let's go ahead and move one of those. So we'll say hand, let's see, minute. We'll say transform, rotate, and we'll just do like 90 degrees, something like that. So now it gets out of the way, and now we can see that hour hand. And finally, we have the second hand. So let's come in here and grab that second. Now here I wanted to go a little bit past, quite a bit past that circle to just look a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to do that, and you can see it kind of jut down that way. And then I actually wanted to go quite a bit higher too, because it's going to be the longest hand, obviously. So we'll move it up that way, which reminds me, maybe let's come in here and change the hour like this, and we'll change this to like, I don't know, 45 degrees. Okay, so there's our hour, there's our minute, and there's our second hand. Now let's go ahead and add a stroke width to these. We'll do like 5, something like that. You can see that gets a lot wider there. And let's move this up and do the same thing for the hour hand as well. And then I'm actually going to move this down here. Let's copy it down, and I'm going to change the hour hand to our white. And then for the minute, we'll change this to purple. If I save that now, they should all take on the color I want. Now, you'll notice something about the stacking here. I can't see that pink circle anymore because the hands are on top of that, the hour hand and the minute hand. So what I'm going to do is actually move this center ring right here. So it's in front of those two, but this one here is on top of it. Okay, now we've got just 2 more things, and they're both text elements. Now, unlike, like you can't add like a paragraph inside an SVG, but you do have access to something called text. And it actually is a closing tag here. And inside here, we could say like 23 or something like that. You can see it actually just shows up automatically. And again, the default color is black, like a lot of the things with SVGs. Now here, I come in here and I just give this an X coordinate. So I tell it where to start on the X axis. And from the 0, 0 position, I'm going to actually move it over 50 on the X axis. And then I actually want to move it up to make room here for the AM and PM. So I'm going to move it up 5. And then let's go ahead and give this a class of date, just so we can style it. And I'll copy this down, and we're going to change this to AM, PM. And for right now, we'll set this to AM. And then this will also be over 50, but I'm going to actually move it down instead of up 10. Now it'll show there we're going to need to style that here to make it more visible. So let's come in here and let's set this, first of all, the date. We're going to set the fill color, which is the same as setting like the color of the actual text. We're going to set this to our var of white. And we'll set our font size to 1.5 rem. All right, let me copy this down, and I'm going to set the AM, PM here to our var pink, and then the font size we're actually going to do a little smaller here, so 0.8 rem, and then text transform uppercase. And you may notice something there, and that is that this text is actually over the hands, and that has to do again with just positioning. So let's move all of these back to here. So now they should be below, and they should be able to pass right over the top of them. If I change this to like 93, you can see now it goes over the top rather than underneath. And so we're actually now set up all the way now to use our JavaScript. So let's go ahead and pull this up. Actually, let's move it over here, and let's make sure we link it. So I'll say script src, and I'm going to set this as app.js, and then I do want it to make it a type of module, which will help us in the second part of the video as well. Let's close that down, and then let's get rid of this. And I don't need that anymore either. Now when it comes to the JavaScript, there's actually not that much to do, but what we do need is to get all the different elements we need to update to start with. So I'm going to actually just create an object here called the UI, and I'm just going to grab all the different elements we're going to need. So we're going to need our date, and this is an object here, so I need to do a colon, and we'll say document .query selector, and I just want to grab my date class. I could have done an ID on that as well, and this needs to be comma here and here. But we'll grab both of those and now change this to AM, PM. And then I need this to be an underscore here to work properly. And then let's copy this down again. And I'll just change this to say second. And then this, I think we had hand second like that. Copy it down and we'll change this to minute. Copy down and we'll change this to hour. Okay, so I've got all of those things now ready to be manipulated by my JavaScript. Now we want this to all be based off the current time. So let's go ahead and write a function here. We'll call it update clock. And we won't need to pass in anything, but we're going to just say now equals to new date, like that. So this will be our current date, basically offset for our time zone, which is the one I'm currently in, and yours would be different depending on what time zone you're in. Now it may be tempting just to say, hey, let's animate this every second with something like set timeout. And while that's not wrong, it actually isn't necessarily super accurate because it just gets added to the call stack in JavaScript. So what would be more accurate is to actually use something called requestAnimationFrame. And what we'll do is we'll actually pass at our update clock function here. This requestAnimationFrame happens in a different order in kind of the painting of the CSS and the page itself, and so that allows it to basically be before anything else is run, so that you're not being held up by some function that might be taking way too long and kind of actually pushing your clock out of sync with your actual date. And that could happen if you're using something like setTimeout. Now, requestAnimationFrame only works one time, so we actually also need to have this inside here, and it recalls itself. So this is what's called a recursive function. But now that we've got our date, let's go ahead and determine what our seconds, our date, our AM and PM, all that kind of stuff should be. So let's go ahead and let's start with the date itself. So we'll say const date is now equal to, we're going to take our now and say get date. Now, if I were to console log this, it's going to be happening basically about 60 frames a second, because that's about how often things paint. And here it says it's the 25th. Now, I can use that to then update my UI. So I can just say UI.date.text content equals date, like that. And now it should update automatically to 25. So all we're going to do is update things just like that all throughout. So let's actually next come and rather than do the AM and PM, let's do the second next. And let's separate some of the stuff out. So we're going to say like UI update, and then here we're obviously getting the time. Let's come in here next and say seconds equals to, that's our now, which is the current exact time, dot get seconds. Now let's copy this down. We've got our minutes now. This is get minutes. And then we've got our hours. All right, and then let me not capitalize this here. Okay, so now we've got all these, but if we were to just update kind of the position of our hands with this, we're not getting it on the 360-degree axis that we need. So we're going to need to do a little bit of math when it comes to each of these. Let's go ahead and set it up first of all, just so that we're ready. So I'm going to say UI.second.style.transform. I'm going to set this to be equal to, in backticks here, rotate, and then we're going to pass in here, if I can type, we're going to pass in our seconds, and then our degrees, and then that should close out nicely. All right, so if I do that, you're going to see it moves to right here, and then every time the frame is updated, which is about 60 times per second, depending on your screen, and depending on how your computer is kind of monitoring that, it'll actually move around. But you can see it gets from here to here in 60, and then that's it, and then it jumps back to the beginning. So we need it to actually move basically every second a full tick around the circle. So we're going to need to do a little bit of math here. There are a couple different ways we could do this, but we'll just say divided by 60 and then times 360. Now, because of kind of the bed mass, the order of operations here, this is going to happen first, and then it will multiply it times 360. So if I do that and save it, you now see it'll actually move around with each tick of the clock. When it hits there, it'll just kind of keep going all the way around. All right, so that's working. Now, we can actually do something else because it's updating more than every second. It's updating every time the animation frame is being painted. What we can actually do is come in here and let's wrap this, get seconds. And what we can do is we can add to it any milliseconds that are happening. So we can say plus now.get milliseconds. And then we can divide that by 1,000, which will give us how many microseconds, how many milliseconds we have in between, which will just move it calmly all the way around like this. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to comment this out just so we can kind of keep that stable. We know that we got that one set. Now let's come in here to our get minutes. And here we're going to do very much the same thing. So we're going to say divided by 60 because there's 60 minutes in an hour. And that's how many basically divisions we need times 360. And then for hours, we've got 12, obviously in our kind of clock, times our 360. So if I save those and I copy these down here, let's go ahead and update this to minute. And then this should be hour. And then this should be minutes. And this should be hours. All right, so let's uncomment these. And that's what time it is. All right, so it's now moving around. Now, if I were to zoom in here really close, you might see that the minutes basically aren't moving at all. And neither is the hour, and it'll basically just tick. Once we get up here, it should tick over to the next minute. All right, oh, that's the minute. Yeah, so that one moves. All right, so that's great. But if I wanted to actually like kind of move like the seconds is, then what I can do, let's go ahead and comment these out just so it's not distracting. We can do the same thing here. So let's wrap these here. And then I'll come here and wrap these. And here we're going to say plus now dot get, and then we'll say, first of all, get seconds divided by 60. And this would be for the minutes. And then we're basically going to now get any portion of the minutes here as well. So what we're doing is we're tacking on to the end of hours, however many half minutes or quarter minutes or whatever we have left onto those hours, so that it'll actually micro move with each of these animation frame updates. So let's comment this stuff out here. And now you can see that that's happening kind of calmly all the way around. And technically now, these two, if I can get over to the minute, they're just moving just a little bit like that. You can see just barely ticking around, which is more realistic to like how a true clock might work. All right, so we are going to call that first half of the project done. If I jump over here, you see it's now moving around. It's giving me the correct time, the correct hour, and everything is working. And we just wrote a little function to update that clock. Now here comes the trouble. What if we want to have multiple clocks on the page? So that's how our original example started. Well, how do we do that? Well, we're going to have to install an npm package and get a server up and running so that we can use it properly. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and open up the terminal here. All right, let's go ahead and move this parcel documentation. This is what we're going to have to do to get everything up and running. And I just pulled up a terminal over on the side too. First of all, you need Node.js on your machine. If you don't have it, you can go to nodejs.org and install it. But then I can just say npm init-y to answer yes to all the standard questions. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab this parcel here, and we're going to add that. And this might take just a second, so I'll be right back with you. All right, so that installed properly. Let me now come over here and grab this npm package we're going to need for our time zones. As we set up those multiple world clocks, that should install quite a bit quicker. And if I open the side here, you're going to see that we've got a package.json file. And if I jump over here to parcel, it's going to tell me basically to add some scripts here. So I'm going to go ahead and add, let's see, not there, here. And we're going to add both of these. And I'll add those right here. And this is going to basically need to point to a file. So let's just go ahead and in both of these add it manually here. So index.html, it's in the root directory, so that should work just fine. And then I need to start up the server with npm run start. We're going to need this server running to be able to use that npm package properly. Otherwise, it won't be able to find it properly for us. All right, so let's click on this, command click on it, and it should open this up. And now it's working, which is what we'd expect. Now I mentioned if we jump over this way, actually let's close this down. We don't need that anymore. Parcel, I don't think we're going to need that either, or the happy use. We'll leave that open for now. All right, so I mentioned what we're going to do is actually make this a little bit more replicatable. And we're going to do that by using more of an object-oriented approach. The first thing I'm going to do, which you could do this in the old version as well, but I'm going to actually strip out all of this SVG code, and we're going to add that in with JavaScript so that we can dynamically generate it when we need to and not have so much here in our HTML. That'll also take care of kind of the weird ticking pattern that we were getting. If you watch it when it first loads, it kind of has to snap to the right position. So I'm going to close the sidebar here and come over this way. And now what I want to do is we're going to have a little function here. We'll just call it initialize clock. And this needs to be a function. And here's how you would do this without kind of an object-oriented approach. You would say document.query selector, and we would grab our clock div and then say .inner HTML is going to be equal to and backticks that SVG code. So now if I do that and I jump back over this way, that's gone. And that's because I need to actually run the initialize clock here. Let's also move this requestAnimationFrame up into that one. And now if I initialize it, it all pops in like this. Now we do have a problem, and that is that it's on there, but now we don't have any access to the UI elements because they're not on there. And in fact, if I were to inspect this, it's going to say it can't find any of those things to update. So what we would need to do is actually remove this here, and then I'd come down this way, and I would say inside here, before I request the animation frame even, I would need to update all of these. And the easiest way to do that is, first of all, let me get these all straightened out, is I'm basically going to come to each of these and just say UI dot, and this will basically add each of these as an item in that object. So I'm basically saying, hey, now create a date item in that object and point it to here. So again, we haven't changed anything from really an object-oriented approach at this point. It's just making it to where we don't get the kind of weird snapping position because it all just loads in with just JavaScript. Let me go ahead and comment this out just so it's not actively moving for us so we can focus on what we're going to do. All right, now, whenever you have anything in JavaScript, like an array or a string or anything, there's different methods that live on that thing. And no matter which string you have, you're always going to have access to things like toUppercase. And that's because there's something called a prototype. And what we're going to do is basically create a class where we can define our own functions that are always going to be connected to any clock instance in our application. So what I'm going to do is come up this way, and at the very top, we're going to create a class. We're going to just call this clock. Now inside here, we need something that basically creates one of these instances of kind of the mama clock. Think about like if we said class string, we could actually create a string that would replace the default string, which you wouldn't want to do in JavaScript. So we're going to say clock here like this. And all we're going to do is now attach things like toUppercase on it. But first of all, we actually need to say, hey, what builds one of these instances? And you do that with something called a constructor. We're going to pass in an element here, and that will be what we use to instantiate this class. Then we can use the this keyword now to reference this instance. We're going to say clock L equals L, and then we're going to say this dot UI, so we're going to actually pull up this whole thing and add it into here, is going to be equal to, right now it'll just be an empty object. Now we're going to actually go ahead and initialize the clock from within the class itself. So we're going to pass it this dot initialize clock, which means we actually need to move this function right here up into our class. So let me do that. Copy all that. We're going to actually get rid of this right here. And let's move it up top here. And the reason we're doing this is because it makes it easy to add additional ones whenever we need them. Now inside this class here, you'll notice that this constructor that created it is done. And now I'm adding methods that are going to live on this clock. And I'll show you that in just a second. Now there are a couple things we're going to need to change. First of all, I'm going to need to say, hey, we're not looking at the document anymore. We're actually looking at the element that we've passed in. So we're going to say this.clockL and then query selector inside of that. And now let's come down here, and now we're not updating UI.date and all that kind of stuff. If I actually come down here, we're going to do this.UI. So this instance of this object of UI, that's what we want to update. And then we're going to go ahead and take requestAnimationFrame, and we're going to call a function called this.updateClock, which will be the function that we're going to move up here. So let's take this right here, like this, and let's move it up this way. So I'm going to add it here, remove the function keyword. Now this is not going to work, and I'll show you why in a second. But first of all, let's go ahead and do this. What I want to do is, let's come back over here. Oh, I guess to my index here. And we've got our clock instance right here, this class of instance. Let's use this class still to actually create one of these instances of a clock. So what I'm going to do is say new clock. I'm going to pass a document.query selector. Now what I could do is just pass it .clock, and it'll actually create that. Let's go ahead and do this. So let's put it in a variable. We'll call it clock1 equals that. And now let's console.log that, and let me open this up. And now we're having some trouble here because we haven't updated all this. I was hoping I could show you how this would work, but this.clockL.query selector, we're looking inside of this. We don't need to do that. Maybe if we just change this, I think that'll work. Okay, UI is not defined at update clock, which is this, which we know. All right, let's get rid of this just so it's not yelling at us, and let's get rid of this for now. Okay, so now what we've got over here is we've got our UI, that's the object that we've created, filled with all the different things that we just passed it here. And this is for this individual instance. And then we've also got access to this property, which is the clock L, or the div, which is just the clock itself. That's what we passed in up top here, right here. Now here, we're not storing this, we're just initializing it, so we're just running that function. But if I were to come in here, and let's go ahead and uncomment this, let's see, I think we're just going to get an error, but hopefully we can still see stuff. All right, so if I come in here, now, let's see, update clock. On the prototype here, I should actually now have access to the constructor, which I had originally, the function here, and then this update clock function as well. So this would be like toUppercase or whatever. That's what these things are. And now whenever we have a clock instance, just like whenever we have a string instance, we have access to all of these methods on the prototype of this object that we've created. Now let's go ahead and finish filling this out, and then we're going to walk through kind of a problem we're going to run into. So let me uncomment this just so we can get yelled at, and that'll help us know what we need to fix. So if I come back up this way, let's see, that's fine, but I do need to come in here and grab all these and say this dot to make sure I'm referencing the correct UI object, and then I need to come in here and say this dot update clock. Even just in referencing itself, I need to make sure I'm doing that. Now, you may be like, okay, well, we fixed everything. What's going on in line 16? It's saying this dot text content. Why can't it find that? So maybe let's come in here, let's go ahead and console.log the this.ui. Let's do that and open up the console here. And oh, see, I'm also console logging somewhere else down here still. All right, so it's not even getting to that. It's just messing up on us automatically here. It's saying, hey, I can't even find this. It's not anywhere. Well, let's go ahead and throw a debugger in here. And a debugger is basically going to stop whenever it gets to that point and open up the dev tools for us. And importantly, what it gives us access to is a bunch of things, including the scope, and it's telling us that this is undefined. Now you might be like, okay, well, what's happening here? Well, something that's a little odd in JavaScript versus other languages is that normal functions, which this is just a normal function, they actually redefine what this is connected to, or it's called bound. It's what it's bound to. Now, what happens is the first time it gets passed in, it's just fine. But since we're calling it on itself, this is actually redefining this keyword to just the scope of this function, rather than to the actual class itself. Now, we can get around that. Probably the easiest way is just to change this here to an arrow function. And if we do that, then this debugger is going to fire again. And now if I come over here and refresh, you see now it's equal to the actual class, the clock itself. That's what I want. All right, so that might throw you off to start with. Let's get rid of this debugger. But that debugger is really helpful if you're like, what is going on here? I don't understand why it's not working properly. Now let's go and come down this way and make sure that everything else is working properly. So we've gone ahead and we've basically created a new instance of a clock. Then we've passed it here to our constructor that has created all of this stuff here. It then initializes the clock, which should throw this function, start this function off. This is going to grab this .clockL, which is our element we passed in here, and set the inner HTML to our SVG. Then it's going to update our object of our UI within the class itself. And then we're going to requestAnimationFrame the first time and pass it our function this.updateClock, which will go to right here. Now let me go ahead and close out the DevTools, and you see now this is actively working over this way, which is just what we want. Now here's what makes this cool. If I come down this way and I add another instance of a clock, move this whole thing like this. So if I add another instance here, maybe 2 or 3 more, they show up. But if I come back over this way and I change this and say, let's first of all do document.querySelector_all, and then we're going to pass it all the clock elements, so anything with a clock, and then I'm going to say dot for each, and then I'll just say for each clock, go ahead and pass it to a new clock, and then pass it the clock. All right, like that. Maybe let's do clock L just to make that clear. Okay, so now I've got 3 separate clocks, and they should all have access to their own kind of individual functions. Now let me come over here. That's not showing up properly. Let's see what's going on here. Well, since I'm not sure what's going on, let's go ahead and first of all, let's get rid of all this. And I'm just going to comment that out for now. And we're just going to console.log this and make sure that I've actually got everything being passed in. So I do have 3, which is what I want. So then let's come in here and let's reference this with something. So let's call this like const clocks equals that. And then we'll say clocks dot for each clock. We're going to pass each of those in. So clock 1, clock 2, clock 3. I'm just going to call this an element and say it needs to pass it the element. That shouldn't change a whole lot. This gets passed up top here. Now that should initialize each of the individual clocks, which then update here is our trouble. So what we're doing is grabbing the document.querySelector. So we're only grabbing the first one. So what I need to change this to is, once again, for each of these, we need to do this dot clock L like that, query selector, and now they should all update individually. So I'll grab this now. They're all going to be the same right now because we're in the same time zones. All right, but you can see how easy it is now that we have this clock class to just instantiate new instances of it whenever we have a new clock that we want to use. Now what I want to do now is come over to this date-fns, and what we can do, let's come back to the README here, is we're going to want to look at some of these different functions that they have available to us. So this UTT to zoned time is the one we're interested in. If I jump down here, it says it returns a date, which will format the local time of any time zone from a specific UTTC time, and then basically it will translate it to a different time zone. So what we're going to need to do is import it, and I'm just going to grab it like this, and let's come all the way up top. because they've broken out all these methods, I can just grab this single one, and you can see it's only 6.6 kilobytes, so fairly small here. Now what I can do is it's saying here that I can pass it a date and just use this function, and I pass it a date, and then I pass it whatever time zone I want. And if we look here, let's see, it's going to tell us that it's by IANA time zones. That's how they all work. So let's go ahead and open this up, and let's just search for this. Let's look at a list of these. So basically, I can use any of these right here and just grab this and update the individual instance with that as a starting point. So I think the easiest thing to do is actually going to be to come back over this way, and on each of these clocks here, we're going to add a data-locale, so just a made-up data attribute here, and I'm going to pass it one of these. So let's pass it something in Africa. Let's see, I'm going to pass it American Denver here as well, and then let's pass it, let's scroll all the way down. That'll work. Okay, we'll pass it in here, and let's see. Let's grab something more in the middle of the list. How about right here? All right, so let's grab all this here. I'm going to paste this down one more time. And then what I can do is just update each of these times, or the H2s here, with the name of the time zone. So let me do that, and I'll be right back with you. So now those should all be updated. What I can do is come back this way and just reference this now in my JavaScript file. So what I want to do is make a couple of changes to this. Number one, let's see, that'll all be the same. Let's come back to this update clock. So I'm still going to get my own time zone, but now what I want to do is actually update the date based off of this function that we're going to be passing it. So I'm actually going to switch this around. I'm going to call this date. Let's get rid of this for now. I'm going to say const now equals, we're going to pass it that UTC-2 time zone here. And now I'm going to pass it my date, and then I'm going to pass it my this.clockL, which is the element that I passed in, .dataset.locale, which is that custom data set that we just added to it. Now all the rest of these are based off this now variable, and since I changed it over, they should all work accurately for us. When I come down here though, I do need to update this date to work properly though. So I'm going to pass this now.getDate, which will get me the date of the month in the time zone that I'm looking at. And there's one more UI element we haven't updated yet. It's our AM, PM here. We need to change its text content here. We'll use our now.getHours, and we're going to write a little ternary right off the back of this. We're going to say if it's greater than 12, then go ahead and make it PM, and if it's not, then go ahead and make it AM. All right, let's save this, and let's see if this needs to be data set. Let's jump over here and see if it's working. Hey, how about that? This is the current time here, and you can see all these other clocks working just as you might expect. They're all in their proper time zone. I here am on the 25th still, and it's PM, and here it's AM. Here they're all the way at PM in the 26th, and here it's AM in the 26th. So you can see these different time zones now just update automatically. And again, it's really easy to add another one. All I would have to do is come down here and copy this down again, and we're set to go. We've added another one down below here. Well, between building out our own SVG from scratch and then custom coding it basically twice, once functionally and then one from an object-oriented standpoint, and then adding in all these different time zones, we've done a lot of work today, and I hope this was a help to you. It was fun to build out, and I kind of relearned a lot of things, or kind of firmed up things that I wasn't quite settled on myself. But I'm sure there's things that you could do that are better than what we've done here. And so I'd just encourage you to look at that community improvements branch and make your own suggestions, or comment below with what you would do differently. Of course, the biggest help you could be for the channel would be to like this video. That helps it get out to more people and hopefully make it more visible to others who might be interested in similar content. All right, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.